never thought the quiet field behind my house would become the center of a legal war. It started with a sound that didn't belong in the countryside. Not birds, not wind, not tractors, heavy engines, the kind that make the ground vibrate before your brain even understands what's happening. I walked outside with my morning coffee, still half asleep, and froze at the edge of my property. Bulldozers, 2 trucks, a crew of workers, and bright orange stakes planted across the grass I'd spent years caring for. At first, I honestly thought they were in the wrong place. Mistakes happen, right? Maybe someone mixed up addresses or property lines. But then I saw the sign they were unloading from the truck. A huge metal board, shiny and official looking. Future resident parking. HOA community expansion. My stomach dropped. HOA, Homeowners Association. I don't even live inside their neighborhood. My house sits right next to it, separated by a thin tree line and a property boundary that has been crystal clear for decades. My family bought this land long before the HOA even existed. That field, it wasn't empty land. It was mine, my name on the deed, my taxes paid every year, my fence line surveyed twice. And yet, here were strangers preparing to turn it into a parking lot like it already belonged to them. I walked straight toward the workers, heart pounding harder with every step. Part of me expected them to laugh and apologize, to say, "Oh wow, we messed up." That would have been the normal outcome. Instead, the foreman pulled out a clipboard and calmly told me they had full approval from the HOA board. Approval. Like that word alone could erase ownership. I remember the exact moment my confusion turned into anger. I asked the question anyone would ask. "Did you check who owns this land?" He hesitated, just for a second, but that second told me everything. That's when the first shovel hit the ground, and something inside me snapped. What followed wasn't just a dispute over land. It became months of confrontation, letters, threats, lawyers, and a legal battle that spiraled far beyond anything I could have imagined. Because once I started digging into what the HOA had done, I realized this wasn't a simple mistake. They knew the land wasn't theirs, and they built the parking lot anyway. But the HOA had no idea who they had just picked a fight with, and they definitely weren't ready for what I did next. I stood there watching the machines idle on my land, trying to convince myself this had to be a misunderstanding. People don't just build a parking lot on someone else's property. Not in real life. Not without permits, surveys, legal notices, something. But the workers didn't pack up. They didn't make phone calls. They kept unloading equipment like this was just another Tuesday job. That's when the pit in my stomach turned into something heavier. I went back inside and pulled out the folder I hadn't opened in years. Every homeowner has one. The boring stack of documents you hope you'll never need. Property deed, survey maps, tax receipts, insurance papers. The kind of paperwork you sign once and forget about forever. My hands were shaking as I spread everything across the kitchen table. There was in black and white. The property line cut clearly around the field. Survey markers, official stamps, county records. The land wasn't in a gray area. It wasn't disputed. It wasn't shared. It was mine, completely, legally, undeniably. And that's when the fear started creeping in. Because if the paperwork was this clear, then the HOA didn't make a simple mistake. They skipped the most basic step on purpose. The thing about HOAs is that they operate like tiny governments. They collect fees, create rules, send violation letters about grass height and mailbox colors. I'd always heard horror stories from friends who lived inside HOA neighborhoods. Fines over holiday decorations. Warnings about parking in your own driveway. Endless emails and meetings. But I never worried about it because I wasn't part of their community. Or at least, I thought I wasn't. Years ago, when the neighborhood next to my property was first built, I remember the real estate signs going up. New families moving in. Fresh sidewalks. Street lights where there used to be open land. I didn't mind it. Progress happens. Towns grow. Life changes. The HOA even sent me a friendly letter back then introducing themselves, welcoming me as a neighbor of the community. It sounded polite, harmless, the kind of generic message you toss in a drawer and forget. Now I wish I had read it more carefully, because the more I thought about it, the more small details started resurfacing. Little things I ignored at the time. The fence they built a few feet closer to my land than expected. The time a landscaping crew trimmed trees that were technically on my side of the property line. The letter about shared access maintenance that I never responded to because it didn't seem relevant. Din moments. Easy to dismiss. Forgettable. Until suddenly they weren't. It felt like watching a puzzle assemble itself in reverse. Piece by piece, memory by memory, a pattern started to form. A slow expansion. A quiet push outward. Inches at a time. Year after year. And now the parking lot. It wasn't random. It wasn't sudden. It was the biggest step in a long line of smaller ones. I drove to the HOA office that afternoon, documents in hand, heart racing the entire way. Part of me still hoped for a calm conversation, a correction, maybe even an apology. Instead, the woman at the front desk smiled politely and said something that made my chest go cold. "Oh, you must be here about the parking project. The board has been planning this for months." Months. They've been planning construction on my property for months, and no one thought to tell me. I asked to speak to someone on the board. She hesitated, then said the president was expecting me. And suddenly, this stopped feeling like a mistake and started feeling like a setup. The HOA office looked nothing like the battlefield I felt I was walking into. It was bright, clean, and decorated with cheerful photos of community picnics and holiday parades. Smiling families. Kids holding balloons. The kind of place designed to make you feel small for being upset. The receptionist led me to a glass-walled conference room and asked me to wait. Those 5 minutes felt longer than the drive over. I kept replaying the same question in my head. How does something like this even happen? Paperwork doesn't just disappear. Permits don't magically get approved. Someone had to sign something. Someone had to draw lines on a map. Someone had to decide my land didn't matter. The door opened. The HOA president walked in like we were meeting for coffee. Friendly smile. Firm handshake. Calm voice. The kind of person who knew exactly how to sound reasonable even when the situation wasn't. He thanked me for coming. That's when I realized he wasn't surprised to see me. Not even a little. I placed my documents on the table and slid the survey across to him. I expected confusion. Maybe concern. At the very least, a pause. Instead, he glanced at the paper for barely 2 seconds before pushing it back toward me. "We've already reviewed our legal position," he said. "Our legal position. Now we'll look into it. Not let's double check. Not this might be a mistake." They already had a position. I asked him the question that had been building in my chest all morning. "Why are you building on my land?" He didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. He didn't even try to soften the answer. He said the community had long-term development rights to the area. I remember blinking, waiting for the sentence to make sense. It didn't. I asked what that even meant. He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and explained that the neighborhood's original development plan included future shared-use expansion zones. According to him, the field behind my home had always been considered part of the community's long-term infrastructure plan. Always. That word hit harder than anything else. Because my family bought this property decades ago. Long before their sidewalks, their streetlights, their neat rows of identical mailboxes. I told him that. He nodded calmly and said something that made my stomach twist. Yes, but the previous landowner signed a cooperative development agreement before the community was built. Previous landowner. My mind started racing. We bought the property from an older couple who had lived there for years. Quiet people. No drama. No warnings. No mention of agreements or shared development zones. Nothing. I asked to see the agreement. He said their legal team would provide it through the proper channels. Not now. Not today. Later. Everything about the conversation felt rehearsed. Polished. Like I had walked into the middle of a story that had been written months ago. And suddenly, I wasn't just dealing with construction crews. I was dealing with lawyers. When I got home, the machines were still there. Workers were marking lines with spray paint. Bright neon stripes cutting across the grass like scars. The field didn't feel like mine anymore. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the couple we bought the land from. About the possibility that they had signed something we didn't know about. A clause buried in paperwork. A forgotten document. A single signature that could change everything. What if the HOA was right? That thought scared me more than anything else. Because if there was an agreement, then this wasn't trespassing. It was inheritance. And I had never felt so unsure about the ground beneath my feet. The next morning, I called the real estate attorney who handled our purchase years ago. I expected a quick answer, a simple yes or no. Instead, he asked me to email every document I had. His reply came hours later. 3 sentences. I don't see any mention of a cooperative development agreement in your closing file. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It means we need to find it. Need to find it. Not it's fake. Not you're safe. Just we need to find it. The uncertainty was suffocating. Every path forward suddenly had consequences. If the agreement existed, fighting the HOA could cost a fortune and still end in defeat. If it didn't exist, then someone had either made a massive mistake or knowingly moved forward without permission. Either way, this wasn't going to be quick or cheap. And then the first official letter arrived. Certified mail. Thick envelope. Legal letterhead. I stared at it on the kitchen counter for a long time before opening it. Something about the weight of it made the situation feel real in a way it hadn't before. Inside was a formal notice from the HOA's legal team. Construction would continue as scheduled. Any interference could result in legal action. I read the letter twice, then a third time, and at the bottom of the page, one sentence stood out like a warning shot. We trust this matter can be resolved without escalation. Without escalation. But standing in my backyard, watching strangers paint parking lines across my field, escalation already felt inevitable. The next week felt like living inside a countdown clock. Every morning, more progress appeared on the field. Gravel piles, wooden forms, painted stakes. It wasn't happening fast enough to be shocking, but it wasn't slow enough to ignore. The kind of steady progress that tells you this machine won't stop unless someone forces it to. I stopped drinking coffee outside. I couldn't stand the sound of construction anymore. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by paperwork, emails, and legal notes that multiplied by the hour. Every phone call ended the same way. This is complicated. Complicated meant expensive. Complicated meant slow. Complicated meant the parking lot might be finished before the truth even surfaced. My attorney finally called back after reviewing everything again. His tone was careful, measured, the tone professionals use when they don't want to promise good news. He said something that shifted the ground under me again. If the HOA truly has a cooperative development agreement, it would normally be recorded with the county. Normally. That word kept echoing in my head. Normally meant there was a place to look. And for the first time since the bulldozers arrived, I felt a tiny spark of control. The county records office smelled like paper and dust and old air conditioning. Rows of filing cabinets. Quiet voices. The kind of place where time feels slower. I requested every document tied to my property. Every deed. Every easement. Every record going back as far as they had. The clerk disappeared into the back and returned with a stack of files thicker than a textbook. I carried them to a table and started flipping pages. Date transfers, survey maps, tax history, utility easements, water access records, old zoning notes, decades of paper telling the story of this land, but not the agreement. I kept searching, page after page, hour after hour. Nothing. My eyes were starting to blur when I noticed a thin folder tucked between 2 larger ones. Smaller, older. The paper slightly yellowed at the edges. It didn't have my name on it. It had the name of the couple who owned the land before me. My heart started beating faster. Inside was a single document labeled Preliminary Development Correspondence. Not agreement. Not contract. Not approval. Correspondence. The date was from years before the HOA neighborhood even broke ground. I read the first paragraph once. Then again, it wasn't a signed agreement. It was a letter, a proposal, a request from a future HOA developer asking the previous owners to consider a cooperative development plan in the future. It talked about share benefits, community growth, possible infrastructure expansion, possible, future, consider. The language was soft, non-binding. The kind of thing people file away and forget. At the bottom of the letter was a signature line. Blank. No signatures. No initials. No approval stamp. Just empty space. My hands actually started shaking. Because if this was the document the HOA believed gave them rights, they didn't have rights. They had a conversation that never became a contract. I drove home faster than I probably should have. Every red light felt personal. Every second felt stolen. For the first time since this nightmare started, the fear inside me began to shift into something else. Anger. Hot. Sharp. Focused. I called my attorney the moment I walked through the door. I read the letter out loud. Every word. Every line. He went quiet for a long time. Then he asked me to scan it immediately. 10 minutes later, my phone rang again. His voice sounded completely different this time. This changes things. 3 words. That's all he said. But the weight behind them was enormous. He explained that if no signed agreement existed, the HOA's legal position became incredibly fragile. Construction without permission. Development without recorded easements. Potential property rights violations. This wasn't a gray area anymore. This was exposure. And suddenly, the timeline flipped. Before, I was racing to stop construction. Now, the HOA might be racing to justify it. That night, I received another email from the HOA board requesting a follow-up meeting to discuss next steps. Not a letter from their lawyers. A meeting request. The tone had changed. The confidence was gone. I stared at the email for a long time before replying with one sentence. I'll be there. The meeting was scheduled for the next morning. And for the first time since the bulldozers arrived, it felt like the fight was finally about to begin. The HOA conference room felt smaller this time. Maybe it was the way everyone was already seated when I walked in. The president, 2 board members, a man in a suit I hadn't seen before. Their chairs angled toward the empty one waiting for me. No friendly smiles today. No coffee. No small talk. Just a stack of papers in the middle of the table like a silent centerpiece. I placed the scanned copy of the unsigned letter in front of them before anyone could speak. My hands didn't shake this time. I wanted them to see that. The president picked it up. His eyes moved across the page slowly. Then he passed it to the man in the suit. Silence filled the room. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Finally, the lawyer cleared his throat. This document is incomplete, he said carefully. Incomplete. Not binding. Not enforceable. Not valid. Incomplete. I leaned forward and asked the question I'd been holding on to all night. Where's the signed agreement you told me about? No one answered right away. The board members exchanged quick glances, the kind people think you won't notice. The president folded his hands, then unfolded them. Small movements. Nervous movements. And that's when the story changed again. He admitted they didn't have the signed agreement. He said the previous HOA board believed one existed. Believed. The word echoed in my head like a siren. They had built a parking lot on my land based on a belief. The lawyer jumped in quickly, explaining they had relied on archived development plans and internal records that referenced a cooperative land understanding. He said the current board inherited those documents when they took over leadership last year. Inherited. Another word that didn't sound like responsibility. For a brief moment, I almost felt relief. This was the truth finally surfacing. The mistake exposed. The moment everything would stop. But then the lawyer slid a new document across the table. And my relief disappeared. It was a petition, signed by dozens of HOA residents. A request demanding the parking lot remain. I stared at the pages filled with signatures. Names. Addresses. Families. People who had no idea who I was, yet had voted to keep something built on my land. The lawyer's voice stayed calm, but the message underneath, it was clear. Removing the parking lot would create a community hardship, limited street parking, safety concerns, property value impact. He spoke in careful legal language, but the meaning hit hard. The neighborhood wanted the parking lot. Badly. And suddenly the conflict wasn't just me versus the HOA board. It was me versus an entire neighborhood. He explained they wanted to negotiate an easement purchase, compensation in exchange for permanent parking rights. He emphasized the word generous several times. Generous offer, generous terms, generous compensation. Like this was a real estate deal. Like this had always been a real estate deal. I realized in that moment they never planned to stop construction. They planned to finish first, then negotiate from a position of pressure. Build it, fill it, make it useful, then make it hard to remove. The strategy hit me like cold water. And then came the part that hurt the most. The president leaned forward and said the residents were very upset about the possibility of losing the new parking area. He said families had already started using it. Visitors depended on it. Removing it now would cause community tension. Community tension. He said it like I was the one causing problems. Like I had taken something from them. For the first time, doubt crept in from a different direction. Not legal doubt. Emotional doubt. Dozens of families versus one property owner. Was I about to become the villain in someone else's story? The room went quiet again. The lawyer asked if I would consider their offer before moving toward litigation. Before litigation. Another countdown had started. I looked at the petition one more time. Pages of strangers asking to keep what was never theirs. And I thought about the bulldozers, the warning letter, the months of planning, the confidence they had walked into my field with. This wasn't an accident. It was a gamble, and they were betting I wouldn't fight an entire neighborhood. I stood up slowly, gathering my papers. And for the first time since this began, I didn't feel fear. I felt clarity, because now I knew exactly what they were afraid of. Court. Court moves slower than construction, but it hits harder. The moment my attorney filed the lawsuit, the tone of everything changed. The confident emails stopped. The friendly meeting requests disappeared. Every message now came through legal channels, carefully worded and stripped of warmth. And construction on the parking lot suddenly paused. No trucks, no workers, no fresh gravel piles. Just a half-finished stretch of asphalt sitting in the middle of my field like a monument to a bad decision. The silence felt louder than the machines ever had. The lawsuit was simple on paper. Trespass, unauthorized development, property damage, and demand for full removal. But in reality, it became a pressure cooker. Weeks turned into months of depositions, records requests, and legal back and forth that drained time, money, and energy. The HOA doubled down. Their legal team argued good faith reliance. They insisted the previous board believed they had rights. They painted the parking lot as a community necessity and me as an unreasonable obstacle to neighborhood safety. I knew this part was coming. The emotional battlefield. The narrative war. But the truth was simpler. Belief doesn't replace ownership. The turning point came during discovery. The long, exhausting process of forcing both sides to hand over internal documents. Emails, meeting notes, archived files, everything. That's where the story finally cracked open. Buried in a chain of internal HOA emails from a year before construction was a message from a former board treasurer. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even long. Just a few sentences written late at night. But it changed everything. He had raised a concern about the missing agreement. He had warned the board they couldn't find a signed easement in county records. He had suggested pausing the project until legal verification was complete. And the response he received from another board member was only one sentence. Let's move forward before delays kill the project. My attorney read that email out loud during mediation. You could feel the air leave the room. Because this wasn't a mistake anymore. It was a decision, a gamble made on the assumption that once the parking lot existed, removing it would feel impossible. They were right about one thing. It would be difficult to remove, but not impossible. The mediation that followed lasted 9 hours. 9 long hours of negotiations, legal arguments, and quiet hallway conversations. Numbers were written, erased, rewritten. Offers were made and withdrawn. By evening, the HOA finally agreed to terms. They would remove the parking lot completely, restore the field to its original condition, pay for the land restoration, legal fees, and damages, and publicly acknowledge the construction was unauthorized. The words felt surreal when the agreement was signed. Months of stress collapsed into a single moment of ink hitting paper. I drove home that night in silence. The field was still there. Half asphalt, half grass, waiting. Over the next weeks, the machines returned, but this time they were undoing everything. Breaking asphalt, hauling debris, replacing soil, planting fresh grass. Slowly, the field came back, and with it came something I didn't expect. relief mixed with exhaustion, and a strange sense of quiet. The fight was over. The land was mine again. But the final twist came weeks later when a neighbor from the HOA knocked on my door. He looked nervous, like someone arriving late to a story he didn't fully understand. He told me many residents had never supported the project in the first place. They were told the land issue had been legally resolved, told the parking lot was already approved, told everything was handled. They signed the petition because they trusted their board. They didn't know the truth. That was the final piece of the puzzle. This entire battle, this stress, this lawsuit, had been built on assumptions and decisions made by a handful of people who thought no one would challenge them. Standing in my restored field later that evening, I realized something unexpected. The real victory wasn't just getting my land back. It was proving that one quiet property owner could stop a decision everyone else assumed was permanent. The field grew back slowly. Grass doesn't rush for anyone. It doesn't care about lawsuits or legal fees or months of stress. It just grows when the soil is ready. And after everything that happened, watching those first thin green lines push through the dirt felt strangely emotional. For weeks after the settlement, the neighborhood stayed quiet. No construction sounds, no letters, no unexpected meetings. Just normal life, returning one ordinary day at a time. People started waving again. At first it was hesitant, quick nods from passing cars, a cautious smile from someone walking their dog along the tree line. Then one afternoon, a couple from the neighborhood stopped while I was outside and apologized for the situation. They said they never realized the land dispute was real until the lawsuit became public. That moment mattered more than I expected, because for months, the story in my head had been me versus them. One property owner against an entire HOA community. But the truth turned out to be quieter and more complicated. Most people were never the villains in this story. They were just living their lives, trusting the people elected to make decisions for them. Trust. That word kept coming back to me. The HOA trusted old records. The residents trusted the board. And I trusted that property rights meant something. When that trust broke, everything spiraled. My attorney told me later that cases like this happen more often than people think. Small assumptions grow into big projects. Paperwork gets lost. Boards change. Memories fade. And one day someone looks at a piece of land and thinks, we probably have rights to that. Probably. It's a small word that can cost a lot of money. The legal nightmare everyone warned me about did happen. Months of stress. Endless emails. Bills that made my stomach drop. Long nights wondering if fighting was worth it. There were moments I wanted to accept the HOA's offer just to make the anxiety stop. But every time I looked out at the field, I remembered the morning the bulldozers arrived without warning. That feeling of helplessness. That quiet assumption that no one would question it. And I realized something important. Standing up for yourself rarely feels heroic in the moment. It feels exhausting, uncertain, lonely. But silence would have cost more. The former HOA board eventually resigned. The neighborhood elected new members. Policies changed. New requirements for legal verification were put into place before any future development could even be discussed. That part gave the story a strange kind of closure. Not revenge, not victory over people, just accountability and change. The field behind my house is quiet again now. Birds returned first, then wildflowers along the edges. The same peaceful view I had before this whole situation started. Except now, it means more, because every time I look at it, I remember how close it came to disappearing under asphalt. How easily something permanent can vanish when no one speaks up. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that ownership isn't just paperwork stored in a drawer. It's attention, awareness, the willingness to ask uncomfortable questions when something doesn't feel right. Most people assume legal battles happen to someone else, somewhere far away, in stories on the internet. I used to think that too, until one morning I walked outside with a cup of coffee and saw bulldozers on my land. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Always know what you own, always read the fine print, and never assume someone else has already checked. Because sometimes the only person standing between your home and a community project is you. And if this story made you think or reminded you to double-check something important in your own life, Share it with someone who needs to hear it. You never know who might be one unanswered letter away from their own legal nightmare.